Thank you for coming again. We're so excited to be back for another round of EdTPA this afternoon with our new BFF, Elisa Palmer from Illinois State. So, I think all of you probably came in and you found your content area packets that I created for you in the back there. Hopefully you all have your lunch now in front of you. Today, I think up until this point, we've all kind of gone through the rubrics and we have become pretty familiar with the stuff that's in the binders that we created for you. Also, if any of you are having problems accessing anything on Icon, please come see me. I'll walk you through that if you need help with that, navigating that process. But today we're going to talk about academic language and assessing students when using this academic language. And you're going to explore a little bit, go into your own program areas, and start to think about maybe where you're even using this academic language already within your program and the classes that your students are taking. I'm going to go ahead and stop talking and hand it over to Elisa. But if at any time you need anything, don't be shy. Just let me know, okay?
All right, good morning, everyone. It's so nice to be back. I took March off, and I missed you all immensely. I know, right? So I hope everything is going well with your semester since I last saw you. A couple of things before we get started. I want to give you an orientation to the packet you picked up. So if you take a look, the first little mini packet, shall we call it, is actually kind of an overview of academic language for your content area. So what I have done is I have pulled out the materials from the handbook and the materials from that Understanding Rubric Level Progressions Guide and consolidated them for you. So that way you don't have to spend all this time flipping through the handbook. So if you take a look at this first page, this is kind of a summary of what the academic language information is in the glossary of your handbook, just kind of written up in a more formal format, less definition, more conversational type of thing. But all of these can be found both in the glossary of your handbook and in the Understanding Rubric Level Progression. The next page is a continuation of that, and then it is also the questions from the commentaries that go with academic language. So if you'll notice, there is at the bottom of the first page, this one kind of skipped. I think this one might be missing something. So you'll see the assessment commentary, evidence of language use and understanding, and then you'll see from the rubric 4, the Understanding Rubric Level Progressions in terms of the background there. So we'll be using some of that throughout. The second packet are our activity sheets for today. So when we get to activities, I'm going to ask you to pull this one out and take a look at it. And then you'll get to a series of sheets that have absolutely nothing to do with what we're doing today except they're EdTPA. So the first three are, this one has 2 in it, I'll take a look. So anyways, you should have 3. There are 3 thinking organizer guides and 3 peer review guides. And the elementary packet might be short of peer review guides. That doesn't say anything about our elementary people, by the way. That's right, you don't need one. So these peer review guides are what we give our student teachers to review each other's work. And so for each response they have to do on the commentaries, we tell them exactly what to look for at a level 4. It takes some pressure off of our supervisors and off of our faculty because they're not responsible for reading the students' work and giving feedback. But it also means that they're not left with kind of a situation with the blind leading the blind, in that if you have peer reviews without guidance, the students don't know what to look for in each other's work. And what we find is our students learn just as much from going through the review process and having to use these criteria to look at each other's work as they do from the feedback they get from their peers. So some of my programs leave this to students to do on their own, that they have to find a peer in their group to do. Some of my programs have workshops where students come back to campus and they actually have peer review sessions over each task. And then we have the thinking organizers. For ISU, this is our number one nationally shared support. These are actually supports that students can fill out prior to writing out their answers on the commentaries, and it will cue them in to what each response is looking for at the level 4 level. And so for students who struggle with writing, or for students who just want a little extra support in making sure they're addressing what the question is asking, these are actually really great guidance in terms of that. And the last one is we actually break out, there's the evidence charts in the handbook. We actually break those out into completion task lists for our kids to talk about how things should be worded and those types of things. So we've shared those as well. And electronic copies of these are all available, will be available to you in Icon from what I understand.
They're there.
They're there. They are already there.
They've
Woo-hoo.
been there since Monday.
Oh, well, there you go. All right, any questions about that? About those for me before we get started? Can I ask you, I'm going to look at your elementary ed. Can I ask you a question? For those of you who are not elementary ed, is your, where it says academic language and ed TPA 4 in the blank, is it double-sided?
Yes.
So elementary ed, is yours double-sided? I think you're missing pages. So I'll talk to Carrie and we'll see if we can get some copies of that run real quick before. Yeah, because you're missing parts to this. I know this because I was going through. Good thing I grabbed the elementary ed one, huh? So. All right. So, any questions to me before we start? Today's things, because we're only focusing on 2 rubrics, will not take as long today. I am happy to answer any questions you have, not just related to this, but any other questions after we get done with this type of information. I'm happy to field any questions you have moving forward thus far. Okay? All right. So, with that, let's go ahead and get started. All right. So academic language, I will be very honest with you. This was, for most of my faculty, brand new stuff. The idea of academic language. And once we got into it, we realized that it wasn't new to us. We had just never used that terminology before, per se. So it's the language of the classroom and the discipline. And it's the language students need to know in order to participate in learning in the content area. What this goes back to, academic language and the study of academic language ties into language acquisition study. And really for general education teachers, it goes back to, oh, thank you. I appreciate that. It goes back to, it started with English language learners and working with English language learners in the classroom. What we also realize is it pertains to any students that come from backgrounds where academic English is not spoken or practiced in their community, their home, etc. So when they walk into the classroom, the expectations of classroom language and the expectations of the discipline language are new to them. And until they can master those things, they can't fully participate in learning, which means that academic language then becomes a matter of equity in the classroom, because they cannot participate in the learning if they cannot understand the language and the expectations. I don't know if this is going to work. All right. And there we go. So that's what it's referring to as in your classroom for the oral, visual, and written language, what do students need to know in order to understand what's being asked of them and what's going on, to communicate what they know, and then perform in your classroom. So far, does that make sense? As a science teacher, this made sense to me because I was always being accused by my students of speaking a foreign language. You know, with the terminologies we would use and the things we go, so I got this right away. It made a lot of sense to me. Okay, and then why address it? What's interesting about this, for my faculty, the biggest tie-in for us has been academic language and academic literacy. That if students don't have academic language, they cannot achieve academic literacy in your class, which means they can't achieve. And what we find is, research has shown us that students who fall behind in academic language fall behind in academic literacy. And if it's not addressed, the gaps in achievement continue to get larger and larger and larger, and they simply cannot catch up in terms of what's going on. All right, so academic language of your discipline. So I want you to start thinking about your discipline in these ways. What is the academic language in your discipline in terms of reading? So what are the type of texts that your students are expected to read? And texts vary differently, very greatly, across content areas. So you have to think about what are students expected to look at and interpret in your content area. What type of writing is in your content area? The speaking, the listening, the performing, and the creating. Those look very different among content areas, and yet, because they're unique to those content areas, they're the academic language of that particular content area. So here are the questions. What does writing look like in your discipline? What are the writing skills students need to be successful? What does reading look like in your discipline? What reading skills do students need to be successful? In science, our students need to be able to interpret charts and graphs just as much as they need to be able to read a paragraph in order to be successful in our classes. What does speaking, listening, and performing look like in your discipline? Bless you. What will students need to be able to do to be successful? So for example, if you teach a dance class, performance in a dance class may look very different than performance in a history class. Or not, depending on the project, right? But again, those expectations for performance, if we say for a student the objective is to perform a plie, that might be the only dance term I know, to perform a plie, well, if they're truly going to perform, then that's actually a physical movement. But in order to understand that, they would need to know what you mean by the term plie, correct? They would need to know the movement associated with that particular term. And they would also need to know what you mean by perform in terms of that. All right, so what we're going to do is this. I know we got very quickly through my talking, didn't we? I'm not done. Don't worry. I know, you were very sad. Yes?
I was hoping you were going to demonstrate the plie.
Oh,
Yeah. It's been so many years.
I know, right? You're like, now everybody says, what is a plie? I know. I could go down. I might not be able to get back up, though, right? So if you look at, remember I had that activity packet for you? We are at the first activity. I know, you're so excited, right? So what you're going to be looking at that is this. If you look at your academic language areas, if you look at writing, reading, speaking, listening, and performing, I would like you and your cohort people, your fellow people, to sit there and kind of brainstorm, what is writing in our content area? What are the various things that students need to write to create these written things about? What is reading in our content area? What are the different texts that students have to interpret? And then what is speaking, listening, and performing in your content area? So I'm going to give you about 3 or 4 minutes just to kind of brainstorm, so you start to get an idea of really what is the academic language things we have to do in your particular content area. All right, I'm going to bring you back to me. Does anybody want to volunteer some examples of writing from their content area that students are expected to do? It got real quiet. You all have to talk to me, you know. Now, yes, sir.
A word, musical notation.
Excellent. You're in music, right? Okay. See how I put that together? I just yes. You know, what can I say? Musical notation. Absolutely. That is a type of writing.
I know.
That's a type of writing that is kind of unique to your discipline. But it's something that students would have to be able to do in order to fully participate in the learning of the classroom. And with that type of writing, I would assume that would also be a text in your discipline. Is that correct? A musical bar with musical notation, students would also have to be able to read and interpret.
Yep.
And then with that may also come a performance of actually be able to play the notes that are on the text.
Yep.
So those kind of all tie together. But again, within your discipline, if students could not read that or write it out or interpret it and be able to perform it, they can't fully participate in the learning in your classroom.
Ideally.
Ideally, yeah.
If we're teaching well.
If we're teaching well. Well, there you go, right? If we're teaching well, then student learning occurs. Yes. What else? What else do we have? Yes, ma'am.
So we're elementary literacy back here, so we've been talking a lot about that and about how important it is to get kids to think about writing all different genres of writing and think about different functions, purposes, and audiences for writing. So we do that, we try to do that in the context of writing different things for different functions and purposes.
All right, so for those of us who are not literacy people, can you throw out one particular genre?
Okay, so for instance, kids might write a how to do a procedure.
Okay.
Right.
So kind of
how do I
instructional?
make a peanut butter sandwich or something like that, right? Or they might write a story. They might just write a creative story.
Persuasive.
persuasive. They
Okay.
might do some kind of other informational text where they're doing a summary of something that they've learned, right?
Right, and each of those kind of has its own viewpoint, its own
Sure.
kind of things that you look through.
So I've been talking a lot with even my college students right now about writing for others, right? So writing as a gift. And, I mean, some of them write, we do a lot of writing in my college class, and they write things about their growing up time. And I oftentimes look at it and say, have you thought about giving this to your grandmother? And they'll just look at me like, what? I said, your grandmother would love to read this, right? So that gives them a little bit different purpose.
Okay, good. What other examples of writing in the discipline? Anyone else have anything that? Yes, ma'am.
We had for science, being able to write claims, evidence, and then reasoning to support the claim.
Okay, and that tends to be something we do quite a bit in science.
Right.
And in order for students to participate in those things, then we need to understand what a claim is, what evidence is, what reasoning is, and how to kind of structure those in order to be able to participate in
Yes,
the learning.
and then also would go to speaking then too.
To be able to speak in this. There's the new bell. I have to tell you all, the other day I was walking across ISU's campus, and we have bells that go off at noontime, and I had a moment where I'm like, oh, if I was in Iowa, it would be a steam whistle or whatever that is. So. All right, what about tests? What type of text? And you'll notice I put text in parentheses, because for some of you, a text is not what we traditionally think about. So what types of things did you put there? How did you expand your horizons a little? Yes?
I was thinking social studies, so a lot of primary documents, whether it's Bill of Rights, Constitution.
We have the primary documents. In social studies, we also tend to have things like maps as well. A map is actually a text that students have to read and interpret, yet it's not often something we think about as a text. What else? We mentioned musical scores are a text in that particular discipline. Yes?
Visual art.
Or visual artworks can
So
be a
visual
text.
literacy is a really big thing right now, reading every visual. It seems signs as visuals. I mean, that
Yeah.
door is a visual, right? There's a visual right there.
Yeah. It's interesting because, especially since I've been doing a lot of presentations on academic language, so, and as we get into some of the details, you'll see what I'm talking about a little bit more, but now, like, I'll see a sign, and I'm like, ooh, to interpret that sign, you would need to know that symbol, and what goes here, and I'm like, I spend way too much time with this stuff. But no, you're absolutely right, that visual literacy in terms of what's going on is very important, and those things like signs and images become texts, yet that's not normally what we think about when we talk about a text. What about performances, demonstrations, or discussions? Things in your content area that the students in the classroom will be expected to do in order to participate in the learning.
I have one question.
Sure.
So Deb and I went, with the writing and the reading and with the speaking and listening, kind of went way back to more skills that students need to know how to do, but they also need to know the language. So like for reading, inference, prediction, fluency.
Right.
The kids need to know what those words mean
Correct.
in order to be a reader.
Right.
So is that what you're looking for? Or
Well,
is
in
that
terms
in
of that,
addition
it can be in addition to. So, for example, let's take inference. So inference is a vocab term they would need to know and know what that means, but that's also a skill you would expect them to demonstrate.
Okay.
Does that make sense? So that could go under performance or demonstrations. They've demonstrated the ability to infer.
Okay. But in terms of them knowing what inference is, so when you're teaching it, they know what the expectation
Right.
is.
Right, and you're going to see where that'll fit in just a moment.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm going to pick on science for a minute because that's the area I know best. Even things like we ask students to perform a certain lab skill. That is a performance in science. They're nodding now. Why did you all volunteer that? Don't sit back here and nod. That is the goal of every scientist to dominate. So I mean, really, come on. No. So that is good. We talked about music performances. In terms of that, in English and speech, we often have different types of speeches that are actually given. So not only do they write the speech, but then they're also going to perform the speech or
Or they might
perform
do
the
a
play.
play or some kind of drama or acting out a
Correct.
flow for a response to literature.
Exactly. Where would you put, there are oftentimes, we ask students to create things like posters and brochures and those types of things. Where would you put that up there in those categories?
They can all.
They can. Primarily, those are students writing, correct?
Uh-huh.
They're gonna be writing out things to put on this particular type thing. And then oftentimes, if you ask them then to give a talk with their poster, now that you've moved into the performance area as well. So go ahead.
I was gonna say, we did talk about structured kinds of discussions.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really important too, a Socratic seminar format. They have to understand how to do it.
Right, and then be able to work within the language of what's going on. Absolutely. So, okay. So we're going to take a look at how this kind of gets broken down.
Can I
Go
say
ahead.
something?
Oh, absolutely.
In my past experience in elementary school, kids who are in 4-H are really, really good at demonstration. And I'm remembering kids doing things like, okay, I'm going to demonstrate crop rotation and bringing in all these toy farm equipment things, and actually his father helping him get the dirt ready and showing us what crop rotation was with a pan of dirt and his toy. And the father came to watch. I mean, they had obviously worked on this. He knew so much about crop rotation, and he was a 4-H kid. I mean, they were really good at it. And I think that I don't know, we need to look at things that 4-H people do to help kids get ready for things.
Yeah, I mean, if you've ever been through a 4-H program, you know they work a lot on presentation skills, about supporting ideas with visuals, those types of things. So they've definitely got those skills and really work with students with that quite a bit. Okay, so in NTPA kind of takes a beginning look at academic language, because academic language and addressing it is a rather advanced teaching skill, it really is. And so because of that, it's for beginning teachers, here's what they should know about academic language, here's what they should be able to do with students in academic language. So this is how EdTPA lays it out, which is where a lot of that first sheet comes from for you guys, is why we got there. And they're actually going to identify 4 areas of academic language that teacher candidates should be concerned about in terms of what their students need to be able to do. So one is the language function. There's vocabulary and symbols, discourse, and syntax. And we're going to walk through each of these and talk about how EdTPA defines them. And when I say how EdTPA defines them, it really is how the research EdTPA is based on defines them. So I believe I sent a couple months ago, there's an annotated bibliography about the research basis for each of the rubrics. That should be an icon. If it's not, we'll get it in there. But so if you ever want to know why this particular rubric is worded the way it is, there's a lot of research behind each particular rubric. So many of the things, when we started looking at academic language, I actually went to those resources, dug into those, looked at those, developed things for my faculty based on those original research. I mean, it's almost like I'm a good educator or something, right? To look into the background of something and go through it. Okay. So language functions. Language functions are what the students will do with language in the lesson. They're the work language and the purpose for using the language. The biggest key to this is, and we'll make this PowerPoint available to you as well. I probably should have had copies made ahead of time. I'm sorry. The biggest key to this is the verb. It is the verb and what's going on. So, we'll go back to your speaker will demonstrate a plie, which I am not going to fulfill that objective today, by the way. So, but in that particular statement, what is the language function? Demonstrate. That's what I, as the student, need to do in order to fulfill the objective. I have to demonstrate. That is the language function. Does that make sense? Now, the key to that is it's what the students will need to do, not what the teacher candidate will need to do. And many times we see one of the first mistakes that teacher candidates make is they look at everything through the viewpoint of what they are doing with the language. Not that, it's what you're asking the students to do. So let's take that objective, and we're going to go from there. So here you have it. You have your central focus, the big idea of your learning segment. You've got learning objectives and then language function. So if you look at this, almost every learning objective, if it's well written, has a language function in it, in terms of what's going on. Now, the next step is that, okay, within these language functions, there are vocabularies and symbols or symbols that students would need to know in order to perform or to fulfill the language function. So, what vocabulary and symbols will students use as they practice or complete the language function? So let's go back to my inane objective. I will demonstrate the plie. Well, what do I need to know in terms of vocabulary in order to actually possibly be able to do that? A plie, right? There is no way I'm going to be able to demonstrate a plie if I don't know what a plie is. You know, I know what a plie is, and my likelihood of fulfilling this objective is about 50-50 at this point.
Well, there are likely to be a few other things like posture kind of thing.
Correct. Right. That is a very basic one. I'm going to go back real quick. Right, does anybody else want to throw out maybe an objective for your content area and we can break it down? Otherwise, I'll come up with one. You can tell what good ones I'm coming up with today, so you may want to. You may want to throw one out because who knows, I might use one of you next. And we'll be arabesquing before we know it. Ooh, I know. We're getting all sorts of fancy dance terms. You would think I had a ballet background.
Tour jeté.
What?
Tour jeté.
A what?
A tour jeté.
A tour jeté. Oh my word, she had to one up me, didn't she? Okay, so let's look at, let me grab an objective. The student will be able to,
Compare and contrast.
how did you know what I was thinking? What do we want them to compare and contrast? Since you're talking, you get to set the objective. The rest of these people did not set up. So go back on us. Go ahead.
Oh, compare and contrast common fractions and decimal fractions in terms of their function.
Okay. All right, so compare common, say that again.
Compare and contrast common fractions and decimal fractions
Okay,
and
we're
their
going to stop
uses
right
in
there. Okay,
society.
all right. So we're just going to do compare common fractions and decimal fractions. We're going to end there for right now. For us simpletons, please. Okay, so let's talk about the vocabulary in that particular objective. First of all, what's the language function? Compare and contrast. And in reality, those are two different language functions, aren't they?
Mm-hmm.
We have compare and we have contrast. Students would need to know what those two terms mean, right? So the language function in and of itself is a vocabulary. Okay, so we've got those, all right? And now we have common fractions and decimal fractions. Yes, I remember. What's the vocab there? Well, yeah, common fractions and decimal fractions, right? So would you need to know what common fractions are and what decimal fractions are before you could compare and contrast them? That would be kind of important, wouldn't it? So do you see that? So you will notice, so if you were to throw out that objective, if Robert were to throw out that objective, to someone like me at this point, what look would he get? Yes, exactly. You're either going to get the panicked look, or you're going to get what I like to call the glazed donut look, where it just goes,
The deer in the head.
right, the deer in the headlights or the glazed donut. Because the reality is, while I may know how to compare and contrast, I have no clue what common fractions are or what decimal fractions are at this point in time. I'm sure I do if I show the examples, but hey. That A in calculus is not helping me right now, I gotta be honest with you. So, thank you, I still feel that way after 25 minutes.
Yeah.
But do you see why that is so important? So many times, what we don't realize as educators, and especially what beginning teachers don't understand, is they have asked students to do something, and the students may not, it's not that, they don't even know where to start. They don't understand the question, nor do they understand enough to be able to fulfill the answer, so they can't participate in the learning. No learning is going to occur if they're operating in an environment where they can't understand what's being asked of them, and they don't have the knowledge to fulfill the expectation. So right now, I'm not learning, I'm sorry. I'm just teasing. No, thank you for that, I appreciate it. So that's how the vocabulary, so it's always vocabulary in the view of the language function. In terms of what vocabulary do they need to understand in order to fulfill the language function, and what vocabulary do they need to understand and use to understand the language function. Does that make sense? One of the things that students will want, teacher candidates will want to do, is when they're asked about the vocabulary, they're going to want to list every vocabulary word that is in that learning segment. That's not what we're talking about. We're always talking about through the lens of the language function. What particular vocabulary or symbols would they want to know in order to do this? I will give you an example from chemistry in terms of symbols. The objective might be balance the following chemical equation. Well, how are chemical equations written?
Symbols.
In symbols, right? There are letters that represent elements, and then we have these numerical things, and if the numerical thing is up here, it means one thing. If it's down here, it means another. There are pluses, there are arrows. Students need to understand what every one of those symbols means in order to have a hope of completing. They also need to know what balance means in terms of a chemical equation. Because balance in a chemical equation does not mean the same thing as balance in yoga. Right? Different language functions. Same word, different language functions depending on the discipline. Okay, so that's vocabulary and symbols. Now we have discourse. All right, and again, do you notice on my chart how language function, it's impacting vocabulary and symbols and it's impacting discourse? I want to make sure that, especially with teacher candidates, it's so hard to get them to focus on just the lens of the language function. And it doesn't mean that the other vocab words aren't important, but when they go to write about this for EdTPA, they're going to want to stay focused. Okay, so discourse is in essence how the students are going to express their knowledge. Okay? So let's go back to, we're going to demonstrate the plie. How would I actually express the knowledge of demonstrating the plie?
Provided.
That's correct. I would do one. That would be my discourse. So my PE teacher would ask me to demonstrate a plie. I would perform the plie, and they would know whether or not I know how to do one through my demonstration. Let's go to common fractions versus decimal fractions. Okay, what would be the way that students would express how they can compare those two things? We'll start with compare.
Language of each.
Great. Well, how would they show that to you, though?
They'd be able to write a fraction, and then they'd be able to write a decimal.
Okay, so it could be that...
7/5, or they'd be able,
Yeah, so it could very well be that they show the two of them, they physically write them out,
Draw a picture.
draw a picture of them.
examples of where they see it used, like the measuring cups at home, and where
All right, examples where they're being used. And if we went with...
Operations on them.
And operations on them. If we went with compare contrast, what's one of the most common ways we have students express compare contrast?
they write an essay.
Say that.
They write an essay or something.
They may write an essay. What else?
Venn
Venn diagram. We also use Venn diagrams. So your discourse could be a Venn diagram about common fractions versus decimal fractions, and that's how students would show their knowledge.
Using an intersection.
Using the intersection, exactly. It could be a chart where they do likes and unlikes, and they list the commonalities and the differences there. All of those could be discourses that would fulfill that particular objective. Does that make sense? So, and, oh, go ahead.
Just to ask something,
Uh-huh.
so the discourse of this is interesting to me. The school has real particular discourses, and oftentimes there's a label that goes along with it. So the child is either going to say, this is a common fraction, this is a decimal fraction, right? And I think that's also kind of inherent in that we need to teach that to children, because oftentimes it's part of the discourse of a test, that you're able to label things very specifically so that you're clear in what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm a little bit stymied by whether or not there's a particular way of doing this that's going to be more effective for kids in the long run. Teaching them that discourse of the academic language and how it's used in an explanation.
Depends on the content area.
Well, I'm literacy, so I read
Right.
all the content areas.
Well, but again, it really depends on the content area and what the goal is. So, for example, it could be, let's go with, I want my students to explain the role of oxygen. Oh, this is a terrible one, never mind. Let's see. Explain the role of...
Explain the problem with the lead in the pipes in Flint.
There we go. All right, explain the problem with lead in the pipes and Flint. Students could do a verbal discourse where they just talk to you about it. They could do a written discourse where they actually write stuff out. I don't know where you talk about labeling different things between those two discourses. It could be that you're doing a very informal discourse for that language function. Or it could be where you're doing a very formal discourse that you want a full essay structure.
Yeah, I'm thinking about elementary probably, so that's maybe where my thinking about the labeling comes in.
Correct. And then I think that's what I was trying to get at, was more about the area and what the purpose of the discourse is versus, so you're talking about a more formal discourse, a more structured discourse.
Well, yeah, or helping kids get into that mode of explanation, right?
Right.
The discourse is really important for that.
Right, but again, explanation doesn't actually have to be formally structured sometimes. But it could be talking about what are the components of a good explanation. But that could be a casual verbal explanation, it could be a casual written explanation, it could be a highly structured written explanation, depending on what your expectations are for
Yeah,
the
we want our
discourse.
candidates to sort of address those different.
Depending on what their goals are.
purposes, right?
Right. Well, depending on what their goals are and the goals of fulfilling that particular language objective. There are certain language functions that the goal is simply to fulfill this particular language function to move on, or is the goal to teach a certain type of discourse.
So we're not really going to be responsible for making sure that our students demonstrate that they're doing all of those things in the classroom.
We'll talk about that. Yeah, we'll talk about that in a moment. All right. So there's discourse. And we'll go through some examples. So here are more formal discourse examples. Okay? Essays, debates, multimedia presentations, lab reports, games, recitals, demonstrations, etc. You also have the informal ones where students are simply answering questions in class. But that is how they're expressing their knowledge. So many times you'll see when you have language functions like explain, that might be based on a short written exit slip type of thing, or it could be a student's answer in class, etc. It's not a more formal discourse. Other discourses have more formal structures to them, which actually gets us to the next kind of area. That's a good lead. And that's syntax. And syntax are the guidelines, rules, or conventions. And they're usually associated with the discourse. So, for example, if we go back to the Venn diagram, and we said that Venn diagram is kind of our discourse, that's how students are going to express the compare-contrast between common fractions and decimals. I'm still looking that up tonight, by the way. Just because I'm just enough of an academic nerd to now be curious. Common fractions versus decimal fractions. So, are there guidelines to a Venn diagram? Does a Venn diagram have a certain syntax to it? It does. What would be that syntax? Tell me some of the guidelines to a Venn diagram.
Overlap.
Well, they do overlap. And where they overlap, what do you put in the overlap section? The common things. And what do you put in the other areas?
The differences.
The differences. If you don't follow those guidelines, does a Venn diagram make sense? No, then it's just circles with words in it, right? So the placement of words in those guidelines makes it very, makes the discourse make sense. Not every discourse will have a formal syntax. So let's go back to, you asked the students to explain something. If the students are simply talking in class, that you might not be looking for a formal syntax there. You might be looking for them just to explain the information. Other times you might be. It could be, the syntax could be you want the students to talk in complete sentences. And that's a syntax that you're working on. Yes?
Is this where like a rubric might come in terms of?
Well, a rubric, so it depends on what the rubric is looking at. So,
But could a rubric address syntax?
a rubric could address syntax, yes. Same thing with written responses. It could be where you want a written response and you just want them to answer the question. Could be that you want a paragraph. A paragraph has a very specific syntax, yes? It's got a very specific structure to it. And so that's the difference. I will tell you, in EdTPA, they do not ask candidates to address both syntax and discourse. They ask them to address one of the two. And probably some of the best advice I got from attending kind of some webinars on this is, don't have them address syntax unless they're actually teaching the syntax. So if they are teaching the guidelines to Venn diagrams, then they should talk about those guidelines in their writing. If they're not teaching them, their students already know them, they don't have to address that syntax. I'll give you an example from science. there's a certain syntax to making a graph. Okay, there are guidelines to making a graph. If I'm in science and my discourse is that the students are showing their knowledge through a graph, and they already know how to make a graph, I don't have to address that syntax. It's something my students already know. But if I'm having to teach the guidelines for graph design, as I'm also having them create that, then I'm going to be supporting them, teaching them how to do it, etc. Does that make sense? Syntax and discourse tend to overlap at times, and teacher candidates get confused. But the reality is if they're not teaching those guidelines, they don't need to talk about them in TPA. Not that they're not important, but they don't have to talk about them.
Should they address that in their paper? Should
No,
they
no,
say
no.
there
they-
was
no.
prior knowledge of making a graph?
They'll be asked about prior knowledge in a question. That's what shows students already know how to make a graph.
Oh.
Yeah, so they'll be asked about the student's prior knowledge. They don't get, docked if they don't say that, but I just want to make it clear they don't have to talk about both of these. And of the two, students struggle the most with syntax. They really do, about addressing it and how it goes through. So I don't want them to get caught up in the difference between syntax and discourse to a point where it paralyzes them in terms of thinking about academic language. So, did you have a question back there, Mark?
Yeah, I guess, and this kind of goes back to yesterday.
Mhm.
The clarification I'm wondering about, it kind of goes back to Nita's question. I would say maybe one thing we would encourage our science teachers to do is to utilize the construction of a graph as a tool for them to help the kids better understand some concept. Or I want the kids in my class to argue because that's a tool for them to better understand forces in motion. When we're talking about this, what I'm seeing, this isn't so much using language as a tool to develop conceptual understanding.
Actually, that's the exact title of the question in the handbook. And when they go to answer for the rubrics, it'll say, explain how you supported students in doing X, Y, and Z to develop content understandings. So while I'm explaining to you right now the details, so you understand the vocabulary TPA uses and what they're referring to it as, it is in the bigger picture of fulfilling those objectives, which should be towards content understanding, or towards being able to do a certain lab skill, etc. So don't forget that this language function, all of these discourse, syntax, and vocab go to fulfill a language function, which goes into fulfill an objective. And depending on what objective they have chosen, that objective ties to concept understanding, it ties to, in science, inquiry skills, or it ties to exploration. Does that help?
I mean, is it going to be valued in the TPA rubric that our teacher candidates have helped the kids utilize language as a tool to better understand
Well, let's take a look
some
at the rubric.
concept versus our kids made sure that their kids understood the very specifics of the graph?
Please, yeah, well, but my argument would be that if understanding the specifics of the graph is essential to then using the graph to understand concept understanding, then if they don't help with this, they're not going to get to this.
Yeah.
That's the idea, is that you are really breaking it down. So if I have a student who can't do this, is it because they don't understand the concept or because they don't understand the syntax of making a graph? And I won't know that as a teacher if this is a concept misunderstanding or if I have an academic language issue if I'm not supporting these basic things. So it's a building block, is really what it is. And if the beginning teachers aren't addressing the building blocks, then they may make misunderstandings about, they're going to say the student doesn't understand the concept. Well, the student might be able to understand the concept, except they can't do what you ask them to do because they don't have this building block here. And so it's really breaking that down to make sure that you've supported the building blocks so they can achieve the objectives. I don't know if that helps or not.
Demonstration of settled knowledge through the language versus using it to sort of, that's where it's one thing if if I want the kid to use the graph to show me they understand something that I'm hoping by this point they've developed understanding of. Another thing for me to say I'm using this graph for argument. I'm not so concerned that kids understand the very specific rules of argument if I want them arguing in my class to try to develop understanding better.
Right, but if they don't understand the rules of argument, then it could be you're like, well, they can't formulate an argument. Is it because they don't know how to or they don't understand the concept? Will you know the difference if you haven't supported them in how to develop arguments? I mean that's just, I see your point. It's just, and for beginning teachers, that's really hard to discern. Do they not understand the content, or do they not understand how they've been asked to express the content? And so, I mean, there are many times, I don't know about you, but sometimes I would have a student struggling in class, one of my juniors, and I would sit down and talk to them, and verbally they could explain it to me, but through the method I had asked them to explain originally, they couldn't. Well, we had a problem there. It wasn't that they didn't understand the content. They didn't understand what I had asked them to do. I had missed that as a teacher. I hadn't supported that. And so that's what this is trying to get at, is are you supporting students in the method you've asked them to express the knowledge? Do they have the skills to express the knowledge that way? Or not? And if they don't, can you truly understand what they know about content or the concept that's going on? So yes, did you?
Well, yeah, you know, science people, whatever.
I know, I'm so used to dealing with you all.
But I mean, isn't that, these are the two standards, or two rubrics we didn't know who to.
Correct, yeah. We had a science ed meeting yesterday, so it was a great meeting.
Is it because, like, or is the idea that as teachers, the candidates need to be recognizing when these things are an impediment, and then being sure that the supports are there so that it's not an impediment? It's not necessarily that you would always teach these directly.
Correct.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
To make sure that these are not impediments or barriers to participation in learning.
Right.
But in order to acknowledge them, you have to know that they exist and that they may be a possibility. That's a great way to put it. I should have just recorded that. Oh, we did. So now we have. We'll see if that reached up here or not. So yeah, and this is oftentimes, for most of you, your teacher candidates are going to write very few times about syntax, because very few of them are actually going to be teaching about the actual conventions and guidelines, etc. But I thought it was important to bring it up because that language is in the EdTPA handbook, and somehow candidates think they need to address all four things to score well, and they don't. It's always syntax or discourse. The handbook never asks them to address both of them. And I think that's really important for them to know. The ands or the ors in EdTPA rubrics are really important. So those things. Okay, so this is where we're going to start. We've got activity part 2. And this might clarify something. All right, so what I've given you is actually, I believe, the last page of your handout. It says Geography Academic Language Activity. Do we all see that? Am I saying it's in the activity?
This packet.
Yes, it's in the activity packet. The one you already wrote on a little bit. We did some writing. And writing would be a type of what? Discourse. Yes, we expressed our knowledge. See, pretty soon you all will be talking crazy EdTPA stuff like me. Join me, it's fun. All right. So what we're going to do is this, because none of you in here, I don't think, or very few of you teach world geography. I picked an example no one had very much familiarity with, because isn't that fun? And what you're going to do is this. This is a very simple question a world geography teacher may ask his students. What are the similarities and differences between South African apartheid and the U.S. Civil Rights Movement? Here's what I would like you to do. I would like you, for each of these areas of EdTPA academic language, to complete the middle column, just the middle column. Overachievers, do not move on to the next column until we have some time to chat. So what is the language function you see in that question? What are some associated vocabulary that students would need to know to understand the question and maybe answer the question? What methods of discourse might the teacher expect? And is there any associated syntax you can see with the discourse you've chosen? If so, what is it? If not, why not? Okay? Are we example? I'm afraid if I give you too much more time, you're going to move on to the next column, being the overachievers that you are. So let's take a look here. Did you identify a possible language function for this particular question?
With your prompting.
Yeah. Oh, with your prompting. What was the major? So some of the groups thought that the words literally had to be in the question, so they wrote down similarities and differences. Remember, language functions are always what? Verbs. because it's the doing, it's what the student is going to do. So what are some verbs that could cover what this teacher is actually asking this student to do?
Comparison track.
Compare and contrast may work. What else?
Identify.
Identify. Analyze. I heard some people say earlier, explain, list. Exactly. Now, those different verbs indicate different cognitive levels, correct? So that is a key to then looking at what type of discourse we're looking at in terms of that. So let's go on then to vocabulary. What are some vocabulary that the students may want to know? And I laugh when I look at this because I think, what vocabulary do I need to know to even understand what's being asked here? So let's first look at what vocabulary would students need to know to interpret this question, to be able to understand what's being asked of them. Apartheid, right? Apartheid would be one of them. And civil rights. You would need to know both of those to even know what you're being asked to do. What else?
also need to know U.S. and South Africa.
U.S. and South Africa.
They are.
Good. What about similarities and differences? Yeah. Okay. Then you would also probably need to know some things in order to answer the question, correct? Again, apartheid, civil rights, U.S., South Africa, other geography-related things that I don't know at this moment, but there's probably other terms there, yes? Or other things? Movement, yeah. Is movement different? Again, PE, the word movement, versus in world geography, the word movement? Very different. You're the first person who's pointed it out, and like 6 times I've done this. All right.
Would maps be considered a symbol that you would use there?
Maps are a text. And so that you would need to interpret. Now, on maps, there are symbols that you have to interpret. Do you see the difference there? And then what about methods of discourse? How can you see the teacher asking the student to express this knowledge? Yeah, oh yeah, there's different ways. Throw some at me, come on. You guys get bonus points. Oh, okay, the Venn diagram, right? Fractions.
Debate.
I got tutored in fractions now. Good. All right, a debate.
Speech.
What? Poetry, speech,
Play, dance.
plays, painting, dance. Oh, I have never had anyone come up with dance. At halftime, at intermission, you all are doing the civil rights versus the South Apartheid dance, and I'll plie with you. What else?
Did you have specifically framed the
I did.
And mapping places because a good geography teacher is always going to ensure that students can.
What if this is a bad geography teacher?
Then they're.
I'm sorry, I just did that. The have to thing. It could very well be that they're having a map out.
Well, if
someone
you're a
said-
geography teacher, they better be.
Well,
I mean, actually, that is one of the things I've taught. So-
I'm laughing because I'm like, maybe they're not, but I have no idea. I actually took this question from one of our geography majors' NCPA portfolios. This was his language function question or the activity he had the kids do. I don't think he had the map, so now I'm like, maybe he didn't deserve the map. Oh, the shame of it!
It can be all other, other
Yeah.
areas of social studies probably wouldn't need to include that, but if you're actually a geography teacher, then that's as essential as reading notes, reading a map and locating things on there.
And again, that goes back to understanding South Africa, and now he may have them look at maps, he may not necessarily have them map as part of their expression for this particular question.
Well, exactly.
Yes.
I mean, depending on what the assignment is. you
Right.
might need to-
Well, and that's why I asked you guys. Well, I know you all were, someone said timelines, right? Yeah, comparing the two, the timelines. Yeah, it could be creating timelines as a discourse. Now, so it may be a very simple, just verbally answer the question in class. So it could be a very formal discourse. It could be a very informal discourse. What about syntax? Did some of those discourses have an associated syntax to them?
Well, if you have to teach debate, right?
Right, if they're going to debate, if you have specific guidelines for them, it's going to have a syntax to it, right? Timelines have a syntax. Now, the students may have made timelines before, so they understand timelines are linear. You have to put them in chronological order, etc. But some students don't understand the idea of chronological order. And so you would actually have to teach that syntax of a timeline when you first introduce timelines for them. If this is their first timeline project, they would need to be taught chronological order and other things.
Wouldn't every method of discourse has to have associated syntax? Either they know it or they don't.
Well, now it's not about knowing it. Okay, so for example, it could be that if you're doing a simple verbal response in class, you don't have a formal syntax you expect of the students.
Well, they'd have to know how to speak.
Well, how to speak, now, depending if you're going to make them talk in complete sentences or not. That complete sentences would be a syntax. Some teachers don't require that. And in that case, it's that. It could be that you're having a class discussion, you're not addressing the syntax, you really just want to focus on what they're saying and not how they're saying it. And if you're not focusing on how they're saying it, then you wouldn't be expecting a formal syntax of it. And there are many cases in education where we're far more concerned about what they're saying than how they're saying it. So there are times where you will address formal syntax and times where you won't. And that's the judgment of the teacher in terms of that. Yes?
How about if you have to teach them the language?
Can you go into teach them the language a little deeper? Because I'm not sure I understand the question. I might just
So
be...
say they're an ESL student, and they don't know the language of...
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that, because that's where we're going to get you with supports. That's the next step.
Okay.
So, see, overachievers just jumping ahead on me. So, but does this make sense, breaking this down? I appreciate you letting me, for most of you, breaking you out of your comfort zone a little bit, making you look at a different content area than you normally would. I really want to see a U.S. civil rights movement compared to U.S. apartheid, or South African apartheid dance interpretation. That's fantastic. Oops.
Lisa, I'm just a doctor.
Yes, sir.
I'm one that I'm always thinking about connections. And I'm thinking about when with method of discourse, and when we listed all those different things, those are products, aren't they?
Correct.
And I think about the products related to differentiation, offering kids opportunities and choices.
We're going to get to that.
Okay.
You're getting to the connections part is next. Okay. So now you're going to say, well, what will you need to do? So the next step is, it does not matter if your teacher candidates know all about this if they can't help students do it. And they can't support students do that. And that's actually what EdTPA looks at. Can they, at a basic level, plan to support students in fulfilling these things so they can achieve the learning objectives? So that way the academic language does not become an impediment to learning, that they can actually support them. So that is actually what Rubric 4 is all about. And I'm going to show it to you. If you look at the back, for most of you, it'll be the back of the second page of this academic language and EdTPA packet. So we're out of the activity packet, and now we are on to that. This is the actual rubric. And the nice thing about it is this rubric is the same in every one of your handbooks. So regardless of your content area, this is what that rubric looks like. This is rubric 4 in the planning. And what happens is, if you look at the prompt the students are asked, the teacher candidates are asked to identify the language function. They are asked to identify the learning tasks. They're asked to identify the vocabulary, discourse, and the syntax that they're going to use. And then the last part of the prompt is they're asked to identify the supports. What most teacher candidates will miss is that the rubric is all about the supports. Because it's the last part of the question, they tend to jib it, go short on it, don't go into detail on it, but that is the question, that 4D is the part of the question that actually addresses the rubric. Everything else in that question is background information. It's actually the question. So if you take a look here, you will notice that at the level 1 in rubric 4, it's either that the language demands identified don't match the language function, or language supports are missing or not aligned. Either of those will be a 1. At the 2, language supports primarily address one language demand. Now, the language demands are language function, vocabulary, discourse, syntax. Can anybody guess, if your candidates are going to get a 2, usually which is the language function they've supported? Vocab. They go in on the vocab, they support the vocab, and they forget about everything else. So they'll say, we went over the vocabulary, they did vocabulary sheets, I gave them a word bank. That's great, they've got the words down, it doesn't mean they can do the objective. This sounds familiar, doesn't it? Yeah, exactly. So if you take a look there, there's that. Then at the level 3, which is that acceptable level, now we have general language supports address use of 2 or more language demands. So now we're supporting the vocabulary and one other thing. Then we move into, and notice those are general. So in other words, they're general in terms of the fact that these are supports that probably could be used for almost anything. Yeah, they'll support language, but they could be moved into something else and they would have supported that as well. Now we have targeted language supports, where they are specifically showing, and this is a dual jump from 3 to 4. We move from general supports to targeted supports, and we move from only supporting 2 demands to supporting 3 demands. It's a double jump from a 3 to a 4. So the students have made clear, the teacher candidate has made clear connections between the supports and the language demands, and they're addressing 3 language demands. Language function, vocabulary, and discourse or syntax. Okay? At the last one is what we get into with the question you asked. At the level 5, that highly achieving candidate, language supports are designed to meet the needs of students with different levels of language learning, which that's where they're now differentiating and working to support students like ELL students. Where, for example, they may say for each of the vocabulary words, they have a picture next to it so the student knows what that word means. They can see a visual of it as well. I will tell you, when I taught high school science, one of our language support things was, as students had to have, when they were doing labs, my ELL students oftentimes had a difficult time reading the different lab steps and following them, so we had videos, short clips of each lab step that they could click on and watch the video clip and then perform the lab step in terms of going that. And that was the support that we did for them in terms of that. So, because they needed to visualize, they needed to see it going on because they could not, they didn't understand the language enough yet to be able to perform it. But we wanted them to be able to participate in the learning. So in order to do that, I had to figure out how to make the language not be an obstacle. And because I don't speak Spanish, I could put the translation of the word underneath, but again, it seemed to me to be much easier to actually use a video clip of that step and then watch what was happening, and my students responded very well to that. So what I would actually like you to do now is we're going to go back to this, I keep clicking on the wrong thing. We're going to go back to this example again, and this time you're going to fill in the support. So what I would like you to do, pick one discourse. All right, so pick your favorite discourse. I know some of you listed many, many, many discourses. But pick the discourse that would be your favorite. I'm going to die if you guys pick the dance one, because I want to see what supports you're going to give them in that. But anyways, and then identify what are possible supports as a teacher candidate you think a person could give to help students achieve the language function. Okay?
Not really. My friend definitely she swings by as we're counting. She knows I'm friends with Emily. Jenny Winter said it to me. Oh, you're on my card. Jenny is on the strategy special ed teacher. So anyway, she knows I'm good friends with
All right. Does anybody want to tell me what discourse your group chose? What method of discourse?
Venn diagram.
Venn diagram.
We're not dancing.
No, all right. Even with my awesome plie. What? Okay, so you all chose the Venn diagram as your form of discourse. What did you put you were going to use to help support them in this discourse method?
Robert explaining it to us.
All right, it could be as simple as the teacher is going to explain them how to complete the chart, right? Etc. You might give them a pre-made Venn diagram drawing that they just fill in. Or you may decide that they don't need that support because they're more, so you want them to draw their own. Letting students do something on their own can be seen as a method of support. Because we don't give supports just to give supports. We give supports when academically they're needed. And so you could, or it could be getting to that level 5 that you gave some of the students a pre-drawn one and some of the students not a pre-drawn one, because some of you are nodding, is that what some of you went with? That even that simple differentiation of you all can draw your own, you all, I'm going to give a pre-made one too, that you just fill in terms of that. You may go a step forward further and say some of your students, it could be where you gave them a pre-drawn one and you actually had a label at top for each one so they remembered that. You know, again, it could, or you put in a couple of key words so they remembered. Again, there's a lot of differentiation you can do with just that simple support in terms of that. All right, did someone else do a different? Yes, ma'am.
Well, the thing that I have to bring up, because this is my area, we are supposed to be teaching these kids how to support high ability kids too. And if you've given a pre-assessment on this topic and you have a couple of students who are really clear on apartheid and civil rights movement, then the kind of support you need to give is not even anywhere on this page, because it's like having these kids identify other countries that also have experienced apartheid and what kind of civil rights movement have they engaged in. Those places.
So the question would be, would that be support for the discourse or support for the language function? Or would you be giving them an additional language function?
Well, I think you'd be giving them a completely different form of discourse.
Okay, so what? Well, I don't know if it's a completely different form of discourse.
Well, it is, depending on the discourse you've assigned to the class. I mean, if you've got most of the class doing a Venn diagram, and you've got
right, but now you've changed the language function. Because now we're no longer comparing and contrasting U.S. Now we've given them a completely different language function to go.
Okay.
So does that make sense? So again,
I think you've got, but if you're going to actually meet the needs of gifted kids, that's all.
Right. So now you're talking about, you're moving outside of language function. Right. Now you're moving into actually rubric 2, which is planned supports for conceptual learning. So again, let's not, I appreciate your point, but let's not mix and match. Right. Okay. So that's what I'm trying to get at, is if this was the language function that you chose for the whole class. Now, it could be that your planned supports are, you're going to actually give the class 2 different problems or 2 different questions based on that's a whole different issue.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Because again, I just think that for this discourse, there's a good chance it's not going to be appropriate for the entire class, although the 99% teachers don't bother to change that.
Right. And again, this could be a very simple, this could be one piece of much more. This is one piece of a much bigger learning set. So this is this one simple one. So while I appreciate that, you also have to be careful of not losing the fact that we're going through this one particular language function. So, versus, because now, compare, contrast, that would move the language function to something complete, that'd be a higher level language function even, in terms of that. So, yes?
So just so I'm thinking of a question. So in a sense, the Venn diagram is a graphic organizer that allows for a lot of differentiation. So like in my thinking about this, if I am one of the students she's talking about, then I'd probably find a lot more things to put in the middle.
Right,
just because conceptually I could see that. And I remember having students do Venn diagrams where, most everything is separate, nothing in the middle, or one thing in the middle. The more that they can see, they can synthesize how they can have in common. So in a sense, even the quote-unquote gifted,
the level of expectation.
they can do more with that.
Another way to look at it is, for the gifted student, you bring in a 3rd event, and now we've got a 3-level Venn diagram. Now we haven't changed the language function. Now we have the same language function, but now we've differentiated in terms of we've changed the level of expectation of thought. Does that make sense? So you could keep the same language function and then do a different type of diagram for them where they bring in a 3rd event that they have to add to that. That would be more appropriate along the lines of keeping them within the same language function, but differentiate for that higher level. I'm glad you brought up those higher level kids.
Just a really quick question. When you said something about you could provide a pre-drawn Venn diagram or one with labels or whatever, would the candidate need to distribute to who they thought, or can they just say, hey, we're gonna do this Venn diagram, I got a couple
Up to the
resources
candidate.
up here, there's one pre-drawn, there's one with some labels, or you can do it yourself? Would that?
Again, that's a philosophical difference, and
Yeah.
TPA has no viewpoint on that.
Okay, but that you could use, they
Correct.
could show the support that way.
Correct.
So,
Correct, self-selecting, yeah.
mhm.
Okay, so you all had that as your support for the discourse, right? You chose Venn diagram, discourse. Ironically, the argument could be made that your Venn diagram is also support for the language function compare and contrast. Can you verbalize that diagram for me? I mean, not that diagram, that argument? How would you argue, I can't read it at this table. How would you argue that the Venn diagram is a support also for the language function?
Just because
Helping students
it shows. It is a visual compare and contrast.
It's an organized visual of compare and contrast, right? So the idea is some of these things you provide students can be supports for more than one of these language demands. And that's another thing for candidates to remember, is these can be supports for more than one of the language demands. For vocabulary, what would you all have done to support vocabulary? The vocabulary students were expected to use. And these can be things prior to the learning task as well that students have been given exposure to.
We did not talk about this.
Okay, that's fine.
But I could see that as also being labels in the Venn diagram. These are, the labels for the different sections could be components. So these are the apartheid components. These are the civil rights movement components. These are, that type of thing.
Okay, so you could give students kind of a word bank ahead of time of these different things. And again, that could be differentiated based on the level of student and what they need, etc. Do anybody else have different supports for vocabulary? How are you going to help the students learn it? Because this question is most likely not the first time they've seen this vocabulary. So what are some things that the teacher might have done ahead of time to get students used to this vocabulary, get them to explore this vocabulary?
Different reading assignments.
Different reading assignments? And how do we normally get students to pull vocabulary out of reading assignments? What are some techniques that are used? Provide a list, even if something as simple as providing a list and they had to define the words. That could be. What else? Can you think? What?
Acting the words out.
Acting the words out.
Crossword
I know
puzzle.
you all are starting to dance. What?
A crossword
A
puzzle.
crossword puzzle. So they practice these words, they've used them in different things, etc. So by the time they got to kind of this Venn diagram, they're familiar with these terms, and now we're going to be reading through and pulling them out. Part of the background knowledge. And so they would talk about each of those things as having been a support. And then it could be where when they go to actually answer this particular question or create the Venn diagram or whatever they're doing, it could be that the teacher provided a series of a word bank or events that they need to include for some of the students who may struggle a little bit more. So now they know what to look up in the text and what to read about. Some of the higher level students, they get no guidance sheet like that whatsoever because that is not academically appropriate for them. And so those are things to think about, how they can take one activity and structure it in many different ways to meet the different needs of the students in the classroom. And of course, if you have students doing that, what level are they going to land on that rubric? That's going to be a 5. So if you're saying, oh, well, that's a lot for one activity, the rubric recognizes that that's a lot for one activity. And that's why that is the 5 area. That they're thinking about all these different things and showing all this differentiation. And again, how many language functions do they have to identify for EdTPA? Just one. So even though they may have multiple language functions occurring in the learning segment, they write very deeply about one of them. Just one. Even though they'll have a lot of vocabulary in the learning segment, they only look at the vocabulary involved with that one language function in terms of writing in depth about it. That doesn't mean they ignore everything else in their lesson plans, but they're going to focus in on that one and show that in this one instance, they can very deeply acknowledge and support language demands. Does anybody else have a different form of discourse that you want to talk about? Did you all vet it? You just did it first.
We tried to use debate, and we ended up struggling with it a lot, and kind of backing off and saying, we'll just do writing, because this really isn't a debate question, right? When you're looking at similarities and differences, unless you go really higher order with it,
Right.
you're not really debating it.
You would go more of like explain, right,
Right,
than debate.
right,
Because it's
right.
really not an argumentative
Right,
thing, per se.
Exactly.
It's, it's not a persuasive, I have this side, you, no, that's similar, no, that's not.
So it's
tend not
really
to-
good discussion back here for us to have that problem. I have to tell you, I mean, we picked debate ourselves, and then after a while, we were looking at each other like, this doesn't work.
And you know
Good
what?
discussion.
You would not believe the number of times I've sat down with teacher candidates as we've looked over their work, and I've looked at the language function they chose and the task, and I'm like, how do you get this language function from this task? And they realized that they picked a verb they thought would work, and then they realized not. And what this ends up pointing out is how often your teacher candidates think they're asking students to do one thing and they're asking them to do another. And you have that misalignment between the objective and the actual activity. The other day, okay, so don't laugh, but this is what I deal with sometimes. I was working with a family consumer sciences major, and we were looking at her portfolio because she had not passed, and I was looking through her lesson plans. And her only objective, and I love my FCS people, and they do a wonderful job. And so I knew this was not representative of normally what their candidates do. Her only objective for one day was the students will chop vegetables for fried rice. And behind that, she had that as Bloom's taxonomy level create.
Oh, wow.
And I said, we have a cognitive issue about interpreting Bloom's taxonomy, right? Because create is way up there, right? And I'm like, there's a lot of thought that goes into chopping vegetables. I do it once a week. I'm not a big vegetable girl. But anyway, I chop vegetables. The last thing I'm thinking about is chopping vegetables, right? That is a mind-numbing process. And I told our director of FCSN, I'm like, I don't mean to insult your content area at all, but surely this is not representative of what you all do. And she's like, no. And we talked about in their world, create would be take a traditional recipe and create a recipe based on it for someone on a low sodium diet. That's create or synthesize, right? That's the cognitive level we're talking about. And so many times you'll find your candidates will take verbs and they don't match the learning task and they're not at the same cognitive level. I'm glad you all are nodding because I thought it was just Illinois State candidates. Like, they're like, yeah, that is not that level of learning. So I think that is an excellent point back there when you have a disconnect between the verb you've chosen. And bravo to you for not clinging to that language function. Because my candidates cling to their language function. They're in it to win it, right? And I'm like, that's not even the right one. Come on. They also think sometimes that the more complex language function they choose, the higher they'll score. I know, right? Doesn't say that. I know, doesn't it? And you'll notice in the samples I've given you, the prompt questions that I put in that little handy packet for you. Can I grab this real quick? Thanks. I try not to grab people's papers that I ask them. You will notice that each of your handbooks suggests some ones that are commonly used in your content area. Here, we'll just here's the but they can use other ones as well. But it gives them some guidance in terms of that. And so, and again, that's the actual prompt from the handbook in terms of those things. Nice. So, but that, yes.
Sometime, I'm hoping that you will go back to the rubric and show us that 1 through 5 again.
Oh, yeah, I can.
Because you said that they just need to write about one language function.
Oh, no, if they only write, well, yeah, just one language function.
But there were
Dang it.
3, they had to.
No, don't confuse language function with overall language demands. Language function is one of 4 language demands. So, what are the 4 language demands? We have language, function, vocabulary, discourse, and symbol. So think of the umbrella of language demands. Underneath that umbrella are language function, vocabulary, and symbols. And for math people, you also get mathematical precision in there. Ooh. And then we have discourse and syntax. So here, if you take a look, you will notice that it talks about language demands. If you look in the prompt, I'm going to borrow this again. If you look in the prompt for the planning commentary, so I'm back in this academic language overview packet, and if you look at your planning commentary, And the prompt is number 4. It'll say, oh yeah, you guys not have front and back? So that's, yeah, you guys have the non-front and back packet. It will say, using information about your students' language, accents, and practices, identify one language function. So they only write about one language function, and within there, they identify one language function, the vocab, and the discourse or syntax that go with it.
There's like 2 uses of the word language function.
Yeah, that's what I'm seeing too.
Like language function and then language.
No, language demands.
Language function.
Language function, vocab, discourse, syntax. So language demands, function is under demands. Yeah, so all 4 of those are considered language demands. Language function is a language demand, but not every language demand is a language function.
On a Venn diagram.
What?
On a Venn diagram.
On a Venn diagram, that's right. What are the similarities and differences between language demands and language function? Does that help at all? I don't know. Yes, sir.
Can you restate or can you explain language demands a little more? Help us clarify.
Language demands are everything that students will need to do with the language in the classroom. And so EdTPA breaks them down into 4 areas: language function, vocabulary and symbols, discourse, and syntax. So all of those are categorized under language demands. And when you think about it, the term makes sense. Language demands, the demands on the students in terms of language.
So it's a fixed concept. It's not, there are multiple demands. There's one, it's just.
There are, yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And then within there are different language functions, there are different vocabulary, etc. In terms of that. Did anybody else have different supports or a different discourse they wanted to talk about? Are we getting that pretty well, the idea of the supports? The umbrella. I know, I need a whiteboard.
So what was the language demand?
Okay, so all of these are language demands.
Right.
So
They're writing about one
language function.
They're writing about one language
Function, which is a language demand. Correct, that's all they have to do. Again, these are beginning teachers, this is an advanced skill. So they only have to identify one language function. Keep grabbing that one. All right, so now we're going to see how well you're understanding, because now you're going to create your own. Yes. You're going to. Yay. I love when people speak blues to me.
Speak blues to me.
If you take a look, I've given you this delightful blank copy in your activity packet.
Yes.
Create your own. I want you, with your people, to come up with your own prompting question or activity for your content area that you then identify the 4 language demands for. The language function, the vocabulary, the discourse, and the syntax. You also identify possible supports you would use for your children in each of those, or your students. All right? Do we understand the assignment that's been given to us? Are we ready to take on our mission? All right, how are we doing? You doing okay? All right, I can't wait to hear some of these examples. Yay. It's so nice not to be the one on the hot seat. All right, does anybody want to volunteer their kind of activity or prompt they gave the students? What you're having the students do? My back table, because I heard you all talking about it. So come on. Actually, it would be appropriate given your activity that you all would go first.
We said list the characteristics of the strong female protagonist in the Wizard of Oz.
There we go. List the characteristics of the strong female protagonist in The Wizard of Oz. How could you guys not go first with that one? Strong female protagonist, right? All right, so what is the language function that you all chose?
That one.
List. Okay. What was the discourse that you all decided on? Or did you decide on one? Was there?
We didn't, we
Talking.
tussled.
What were some possibilities?
Brainstorming, just talking.
Okay.
Uh-huh. We also talked about listing, actually writing a list.
All right. So pretty simple ones, no formal syntax to them, right?
Right.
What was some of the vocabulary that you thought they would need to know?
We need to know what strong, the characteristics are of strong.
Yeah, what does it mean to be a strong protagonist, right? What does that strong mean?
Protagonist and strong protagonist.
Exactly. What does strong mean in that case? For what does protagonist mean? Anything else you need to know?
Characteristics. What is characteristics?
What are characteristics? Yeah. Now, what did you have in terms of supports?
So we talked about doing a gradual release of responsibility and doing one together. So
Okay.
taking Linda or Dorothy and figuring out how strong they are, and then having the kids take someone else.
Okay, so what would that be a support for?
Method of discourse.
It could be for method of discourse. Could also be for language function, right?
Right.
That modeling, doing one together first and going, yeah, it could be a support for both.
We talked about creating a wordle of what does it mean to be a strong woman.
What's a wordle? Okay.
A wordle is a word cloud, so you just,
Okay.
everybody puts, you can take a list and you put it into this app or something that's on the computer, and then it creates a cloud of words, and the more often you use a word, the bigger the word is.
Okay, and
So then you get this really
I
nice
see those.
visual.
I did not
Right.
know they were called wordles. All right. Things I learned, and so that could be a support for the vocabulary. That there might be different terms they might pull out. All right, very good, excellent. I know you all look like I'm going to come down on you about something. No, that was great. Yeah, I know. What's another? Did somebody have another example?
Well, we were pretty similar. Draw 3 inferences from the text about the main character. And we were thinking of the children's book, Alexander and the No Good.
Horrible, very bad day.
Right. Because that's a great book for them to draw into.
Sure. So what would be your language function in that case?
Draw.
Draw. All right. Good. What would be some vocabulary words that students would need to know?
Inference.
Inference. Draw.
Text reference.
Text reference. Main character. Good. And then what would be the method of discourse? But what did you have them doing? So would they list the 3, or would drawing be your discourse?
Well, that's what we were going to discuss with them, that the word draw can mean different things.
Oh,
Draw and
so you don't mean physically
No.
draw.
No.
Like draw.
So the-
Do you see they just fooled the presenter? I thought you meant draw 3 inferences, like you were physically going to draw
That
them.
would be a planned support for a student.
That's a
Nice.
Go Betsy.
Nicely done.
But that would be part of the lesson that
Yeah.
you discuss, that drawing and inference is different.
From drawing. No, that's absolutely. See how important academic language is? Look at the science teacher went to draw. Yeah, because that's what we do in science. We draw stuff sometimes. Okay, so then what supports did you have?
Changing the number of inferences, or it could be 5 to challenge students, it could be 2 for those who need it.
Okay, so that's more the differentiation there. What supports did you have for vocabulary?
A wordless book, Devon's modeling first, book pictures on the board, so they could have that reference.
Assuming you maybe had done some other mini lessons as to what inference means.
Okay.
If you wanted to help them understand main characters, you could literally have different sized pictures of characters in both Alexander, the mom. Help them understand that.
Excellent. What about discourse? What did you have for a support for their discourse?
That's what we were talking about, changing the number that the student would have to write.
Okay.
Some might have to have it dictated if their writing skills are not.
Okay, so their ability to actually.
Some may do pictures, lined paper.
Probably some modeling and guided practice of creating it.
That's where we were wondering where that went, because it kind of goes both.
It could be with both. You'll find sometimes, depending on how your discourse and language function are related to each other, sometimes the support you use for your discourse may also be a support for the language function, especially if it's modeling. Because you're modeling both how do we draw an inference, I'm still laughing in my head about my mistake, draw an inference, and then how do we write out that inference or whatever we're going to do with that inference to show that we know what we know. So good. Oh, excellent. Now that movie's now going to go through my head. Alexander.
The book.
The book. I know. Okay. Anyone else want to share what they had in terms of those? I've got two literacy. Do I have a non-literacy person who wants to? Oh, you guys can share your literacy.
Well,
example.
unless science wants to go, or one of the non-literacy.
I like how they call that science.
Come on. They had practice yesterday, surely.
Yeah. Science actually has a pretty good one.
You sound surprised. All right, we had, the language function was to develop a scientific argument, pro or con, on the issue of mandatory vaccination of school-age children.
Right. So that was your prompt, right?
Class,
So
yeah.
So what was the actual language function in there?
Argument, scientific argument.
Yeah, argue, right? You remember it's the verb, so it's argue. So they're arguing, and so go
But
ahead.
not fighting.
Not fighting, no. And we talked about that was okay. So like draw here, argue is very different in science than students think about it. Yeah, that's right. So what did you say then was some of the vocabulary that students needed to know?
Evidence,
Mhm.
because that was a requirement to locate evidence to support the pro or con. Opinion, because they were not to use their opinions. And mandatory.
Vaccinations, right?
Vaccination. And of course, as Deb said, what scientific argument.
Yeah.
But in this case, the support would have been a previous case study where they had had experience with scientific argument in a smaller scale assignment.
Having done those.
Yeah.
What was your method of discourse?
It was oral presentation and Q&A.
Okay. And then you all had did you have a syntax?
Well, you thought maybe.
And why did I
You were
think
helping
that?
us on the guidelines for asking questions after. So a group would give an oral
Right.
presentation, and then the Q&A, the teacher indicated that they must provide evidence and it couldn't be opinion when they asked a question.
Right, the teacher candidate had told them that the only way they could ask questions is if they had evidence to back up the question and they asked it.
And another one I thought of afterwards was that the students were reminded to remain in their roles. So even if they were for it, if they had a against case, they needed to stay in their role, even when they were asking questions.
Right, and so can you see where that would be guidelines for the discourse in this case? And they're not extreme guidelines, but again, they were guidelines that were given for the discourse, and that's how that was formatted. So in that case, that would be considered a syntax of the discourse. All right, good. Others? Go ahead, you called out science. I think,
I think so much.
That's right.
Again, this was a group effort. We have identify at least 4 events in sequential order in a story. We happened to choose Little Red Riding Hood, but we wrote it more globally as the story.
So what was your language function?
Let's jump in anytime.
Identify. And there is actually another one you could have chosen for this particular one. Does anybody know what it is? Sequence. You could have gone with identifier sequence. It would have been valid in either case. So, okay. And what were your vocab?
We have a bunch. I don't even think I have them all written down. A sequential order, or just sequence and order. Timeline, before, after, beginning, middle, end.
First, then, next, last.
Yeah. Excellent. Good. What about your discourse? What did you choose? Timeline. Did you also associate a syntax with that or no?
We did not.
Okay. Which is
but
fine.
We have great plan supports.
Oh, good. Can I hear that? Yay. You just gave the verb great. I have high expectations.
Well, we're not dancing. We really saw it as a time for opportunities to differentiate.
Yeah, sure.
So pictures, words, technology, smart words.
For which parts? What were you?
Organizer.
Okay.
For the timeline.
For the timeline. Okay, so this is for your discourse. Oh, that's excellent.
Pre-made cards, physical representations of the characters and things within the story.
For the vocab or for the timeline?
For the timeline.
Oh, great.
All this is for the timeline.
You all were getting creative, weren't you? Yes, what were you putting down as a support for the language function?
A list of vocabulary words maybe, or prior knowledge on if then, next then.
Okay, yeah, because remember, this is supposed to be, if your language function was list, or identify, was it identify? Identify, then there needs to be something about helping them to identify. If it was sequence, helping them to sequence. And so it's kind of just something to keep in mind there. Oh, no, that's excellent, very good. Are we feeling better about this? In one way, it reiterates truly how complex the world of teaching is. That we can go this in depth about this one area, right? I mean, look how much time you spent on one activity, identifying one language function, identifying the different things you could do with it, and how you would support it. What you just did is the expectation for your teacher candidates on EdTPA. They're going to be expected to break this down and do exactly what you just did, all right, for one language function in their learning segments. Just one, all right? But this also, the other reason I like giving this to you all is it may give you some ideas of activities you can do with your students to help them in terms of analyzing some of the language demands that they're expecting of the students they have in their classroom. So with that. All right. So we've I've already gone over this really in the presentation, but here's what your candidates are going to be asked to do. In task 1, they're going to be asked to choose one learning task, identify the language, and that should say, the language function, how the students will use the language function, and how they'll be supported in using, and the language, the academic language. And then explain how students use the academic language and provide evidence of that use. So again, identify the academic language, how they'll use the academic language. And remember that academic language includes 4 language demands: language function, the vocabulary, the discourse, and the syntax. And again, they're going to have lots of language functions in their learning segment. They only need to address one. But that one that they choose in the planning task, they will need to show evidence of in the assessment task. All right? And that's where task 1 and task 3 tie together. Rubrics 4 and 14, whatever they chose for their language function in task 1, they're going to have to show evidence of in task 3 with rubric 14. And so many times when they go to choose that one assessment for task 3, one of the criteria we tell our students is, what do you really want in that work sample? The language functions that you talked about. So your work sample should not just show evidence of student learning in that, but it should also include your language function. They can include additional evidence if it's not on their work samples. They can show a video clip of up to, it's either 3 or 5 minutes. I think it's 3 minutes showing students using the language function and vocabulary in video if they want instead. And some students choose to do that based on what's going on. So for example, if I go back to the science example, that teacher candidate may have chosen to show a video clip of the students actually presenting their oral arguments as evidence of attempt at language use for that language function. So does that make sense? But that's how these tie together. And so when students go to choose their language function in their planning task, that one that they're going to highlight, they also want to keep in mind that that's the same one they're going to have to show evidence for in task 3 and such. So little bit of advice from someone who's been through this quite a few times with that. So, and here's that rubric 14. So this is that rubric 14 where they show evidence of the language use. And again, this is where it's the same in all your handbooks. So even though I took this one from the History Social Studies one, it's really the same in all the handbooks. So again, you'll notice in level 1, this is candidate identifies student language use as superficially related or unrelated to language demands. So their evidence doesn't really match what what language function they said it was, or their description of language use is not consistent with the evidence. So they're saying this is what this is, and the score is looking at the evidence provided going, no, it's not, with that. The candidate describes how students use only one language demand, so vocabulary, symbols, function, discourse, and syntax. Again, what is the number one reason candidates will be at a 2? They show use of what? Vocab. They ignore all the other ones. Okay? Level 3, identify students' use of language function and one other, either vocab, discourse, or syntax. So note, to be at a 3 on rubric 14, they have to show students' use of the language function of the verb. So the argue, the list, the identify, they have to show that plus one other one. And then Mark, level 4 will be your favorite because not only, so now this is a double jump. Remember we talked about there being a double jump in rubric 4? We've got a double jump in rubric 14. Now we've moved to 3 language demands, plus in ways that develop content understandings. And the candidate specifically has to talk about how this usage shows that students have developed content understandings. So that's a double jump there. And level 5, now we've got all of this, plus now we've got our high level of showing that students doing it with different learning needs, which is where, remember they picked 3 student work samples? So you have a student, a high achieving student, an average, and a lower achieving student. They can show the student works in all those 3 in the different levels. Now you're at that 5 level. So the 5 level in rubric 4 was differentiation for students with varied learning needs. The level 5 in rubric 14 is showing evidence of language use by the students of differentiated learning needs. Does that make sense with all of that? All right, good. So here's the deal. When we first started implementing EdTPA, academic language was the number one thing that freaked our student teachers out, because the first time they saw academic language, that terminology, such as syntax and discourse and everything, was when they got their handbooks at the beginning of student teaching, which is not a great thing to have happen. And so one of the things that as a program we've had to go through, and I think these are great guiding questions for programs as they go to implement, is where do students get introduced to the academic language demands? Where do they practice identifying them? Where do they get introduced to different supports? Where do they get to practice identifying supports? And when do they get to practice identifying student use of these things? Where in the programs are these things going to happen? Because these are scaffolded skills. You cannot support academic language demands until you know what they are and you can identify them. And so for many of us in the classroom today, we've been in education for years, so the ability to identify and support them came fairly naturally. You may not have always verbalized it that way, but it came fairly naturally. These are beginning teachers. And so really looking at where are we intentionally introducing them to these things, how are we doing this, is going to be a conversation that programs are going to need to have in terms of that. For some of you, it might just be tweaking some of the language you use, no pun intended. For others of you, this may be a whole new thing that you're introducing and the idea behind. So the good news is for all of you, you're all using the same language in terms of that. That has been a great uniter for my faculty, is now when we talk about academic language, my music people and my PE people can talk freely to each other and know what each other's talking about in this area at least. Because they understand when they say language function, we all know that's the verb that the work that you're asking the students to do in terms of that. And so it's been an interesting phenomenon at Illinois State, watching us collaborate on academic language. We actually have seen that our departments have really united and become learning communities for each other, and we can share examples across disciplines, and people can see the commonalities, which is really nice. We tend to be very siloed at Illinois State, and EdTPA's kind of had this impact of bringing teacher ed together, both in good ways and bad ways sometimes, but it really has been something we've worked through together. But these are key questions that your programs are going to have to look at and think about, because it really should be scaffolded as students work through their preparation work and intentionally with that, or they're going to freak out. I guess that's my technical term for it. It seems to be what we always talk about, and there's enough to freak out about in student teaching without there being new vocab with that. So with that, that's all I have for you today. Actually, I know, right? You are more than welcome to stay afterwards, ask questions, etc. I hope this has been valuable to you all in terms of exploring. I'm here for as long as you want. But, and again, thank you all.